Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. With me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And we are once again joined by a guest who's appeared on our show before, Gonzalo Lira, who is, of course, a filmmaker, a writer, a journalist, and he's living in Ukraine. So he's right in the front line, or at least close to the front line. And since you were last with us, which was, I guess, maybe a couple of months ago, there have been obviously several military developments. The Lugansk has been completely liberated. And now the fight is on for the Donetsk. And but as far as much of the Western media coverage is concerned, we still keep reading about how badly the war is going for Russia. And we keep saying Russia is losing, losing men hand over fist. It's losing hardware. Missiles.
Peter can attest to the fact that Zelensky was riding a Ukrainian tank on the outskirts of Moscow, wasn't he? I mean, it's absurd. Look, it's funny if it weren't tragic, because the tragedy, of course, is that you have hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers who are being killed needlessly. And that is the tragedy. This is a war crime.
And that's every day.
Every day, yes. Between 500 and 1,000 Ukrainian armed forces soldiers are being killed at the front every day. They are outmatched, yeah? I mean, like, look, you can be, for instance, Peter, you're a tennis player maybe, and, you're a decent tennis player. If you go up in front of Roger Federer, I'm sorry, you're going to lose. I don't, no disrespect to you, but it's just the reality. You have to know when you are outclassed. There are things that I'm very good at, but against somebody who's just better than I am, I just have to admit, yes, this guy is outclassing me, and that's life. And nobody's questioning the heroism or bravery of these Ukrainian soldiers. What I am questioning at this point is the sanity and, quite frankly, the morality of the Zelensky regime, because to throw away lives like this pointlessly, it serves no purpose. It is only destroying Ukraine.
It's so obvious that if you're paying attention, and one of the conclusion that I've come to is that Zelensky and his crew, they want as much money they can pump out of the West as they possibly can before they have to make some kind of decision, or when Zelensky, imitating the Afghan president, just airlifts the money out with him and he goes to some third destination. I'm sorry to be so cynical, but I can't see any other way around it. And plus, I'm sure you've been coming across these stories how mayors all across Ukraine are saying, look, I mean, everything goes to Kiev, and then if we get anything, it's crumbs, okay? I mean, where's all this going, okay?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's being stolen. It's being stolen.
Well, of course. That's George and I said that on day one. Okay, because the day before, that was a talking point. Ukraine is a corrupt place, and now that talking point has disappeared. Or it's on the margins now. It's beginning, because there is fatigue here. I mean, certainly the Russians haven't needed yet. I mean, what's going on?
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, George. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the fatigue is emerging, which is that while they keep repeating, oh, Russia's doing badly, they're not able to go with the corollary, which is, well, Ukraine is doing well. Because if you ask, well, Ukraine is doing well, what has it done well? What territory has it recaptured? What offensives has it mounted? Where has it won anything? They keep still talking about this Kiev, this fictional battle of Kiev.
Oh yeah,
that never happened. But
completely fictional.
It's still somehow in the future. Yeah, there's going to be an offensive in Kherson any moment now. But I think that's the problem. They're not able to come to Biden or Blinken and say, well, here, we've achieved this, this, and this, because they haven't achieved anything.
Well, the thing is, the American administration knows that they haven't achieved anything, and they're not stupid, or not that stupid at any rate. The Pentagon certainly knows exactly the score. And so everybody in Washington and within the Beltway knows that Ukraine has been losing from the get-go, that there was no battle in Kiev, that this offensive in Kherson is imaginary, but they have decided, and this seems to be the trade, and you two tell me if you think I'm wrong or more or less right. It seems that the trade is Washington will keep feeding Zelensky money so long as Zelensky keeps pushing soldiers in front of Russian artillery. And that seems to be the play here. And in Washington, they're perfectly aware that the weapons and the money that they're sending to Ukraine is being siphoned off, embezzled, stolen. They know this, and they are doing it deliberately because what they really want is to just keep on throwing bodies at the Russian army, because they have this absurd notion that by throwing Ukrainian bodies at Russia, Russia will somehow get weakened. They don't seem to understand even modern warfare. They don't understand certainly industrial warfare, the kind of industrial warfare that's taking place right now in Ukraine, where it is estimated conservatively that for every one Russian casualty, Ukraine is suffering 7. And these are people who are not pro-Russian. These are Western observers. And that seems to be the ratio at this point. The BBC at the end of July, did a survey throughout Russia of all Russia's social media, trying to count up how many dead soldiers. Because you see, you can't hide dead bodies, of course. What happens is that they get buried, and a burial of a soldier, there's an announcement, and the whole shebang. And the BBC was only able to count 5,000 Russian dead, and they were disappointed. They were like, "Where are all the others? The great victory." And no, whereas it's conservatively estimated at this point that Ukraine has lost as many as potentially 50,000 men dead, and insofar as wounded, captured, deserted, it's probably twice that number. So we're going into an army that went in, a fighting army that went in with 230,000 men, and right now, conservatively, it's estimated that they are down to about 80,000. If you consider the losses from killed in action and the captured, missing in action, and deserters, and wounded, of course. So it's a disaster. They should end this. This is inhumane at this point. The only bright spot is that, now the Battle of the Donbass is about to end. The Russians are about to break through, and they're going to overrun Kramatorsk. And once that happens, once it's clear that the Battle of the Donbass is over, then it could be a come to Jesus moment where the Ukrainian people and whatever is left of sanity in the Kiev regime says, enough, and they try to shut it all down finally. But we'll have to wait and see.
We have to point out, it's very important for our viewers to understand, is that this was an army that was trained, moneyed, leadership, logistics, the works for 8 years. Okay, and George and I always use shortcut, and we shouldn't. None of us should. This war has been going on for 8 years. Okay. Yeah. And so I think it was Scott Ritter writes, George, that he said, this was a very powerful army if you compare them to NATO armies. Of course, the US has the largest military establishment in the world. If we look at NATO, Turkey comes in second place. And then the de facto member of NATO was Ukraine. Okay. Yeah. I mean, people don't like to mention this, is that, it was the best force they could muster. There was a lot of money poured into it, a lot of help, a lot of assistance. I have to absolutely believe that there are Americans and British on the ground helping them use this military hardware.
Absolutely, no question.
And so, it's David and Goliath. Well, maybe it's so, but Ukraine was given a lot of backing in every sense of possible way. So this is a real military conflict.
Right. That brings up an interesting question. So maybe it's a slightly side issue, but Stoltenberg the other day was in Norway, gave one of his.
I hate him.
Yeah,
we all do.
Yeah,
he's an idiot.
Yeah,
that man has negative IQ points as far as I'm concerned. But I'm sorry, George.
Yeah, no, he was at this the summer camp, that same summer camp when Anders Breivik murdered all those people.
Yeah.
In 2011. So he was addressing this the summer camp, and he was saying that, well, we're doing what we can for Ukraine, self-defense and so on. And said, but NATO is not a party to the conflict, and he was sort of puzzling, because then he said, what did he mean by NATO is not a party to the conflict? We don't have any troops there. So that's his kind of definition. Well, we don't have any troops. Now, in the first place, I don't know whether they have troops there or not. That's just his claim. But even if you don't actually have direct men in combat, you are still a party to the conflict. I mean, the United States had advisors and trainers in South Vietnam for a decade, at least a decade, before the men with with in combat started arriving.
Yeah,
That's still American troops. I mean, there were thousands of advisors and trainers in South Vietnam. I mean, his ridiculous kind of hair splitting, saying, "Well, we're not a party to the conflict, we don't, because the 82nd Airborne Division isn't actually fighting in Ukraine." I mean, it just shows the delusional nature of NATO in general.
Well, it's the lying that I find just despicable. But well, look, at the end of the day, what's very obvious retrospectively, because we're coming in on what is it now? It's going to be 6 months. It's 5.5 months since this conflict started. And what's very, very clear is that NATO got spooked. The Pentagon got spooked early on. And it seems retrospectively that you all recall that strike on that training center in Yavoriv, just west of Lviv, just about 20 miles from the border with Poland, right? That was a staging area. That was, in fact, a training area where NATO would send troops. It was the International Security Peacekeeping, blah, blah, blah. I forget the name of it, but everybody calls it Yavoriv. And there, the Russians early in March, I do believe like around, I want to say that like the 7th of March or something like that, they sent this missile strike and annihilated over 400 troops that were all for it. They were contractors, volunteers, and among them were NATO personnel who were going to be laying the groundwork for more NATO to enter the conflict. And the Russians, just blew them away with a missile strike in the middle of the night. The Russians destroyed some $400 million worth of gear in the one go. And the thing that I have heard from multiple sources is that the Pentagon got completely freaked out by this attack for 2 reasons. Number one, they didn't see these missiles coming. And that was the thing that totally spooked them. They were hit really hard. It was a swarm of missiles, like about a dozen. They were hit and they didn't see them coming until, 15 seconds before the arrival. I mean, no chance to react, no chance to do anything. And their air defenses were completely useless against this missile strike. Not one of the missile defense that was in place at that time could stop these missiles, and they were hypersonics. It was the one time that they've been used in this conflict so far. And it was clearly a message. And the message was, if NATO steps in, we're gonna really fry your butt, okay? And that seems to me the reason that the Pentagon has been so leery of actually putting troops on the ground, because they know that they can't take the Russians. Because also there's something else, that from the very start of this conflict, everybody's been saying, why aren't the Russians using their top tier gear, their best missiles, their best tanks, their best air defense systems? They're using the second tier equipment, which is very good, more than enough to deal with the Ukraine armed forces, but not their top tier stuff. Why? It's very obvious, because they were saving it in case that they needed to use it for NATO, and they didn't want to use them and have NATO study them and be able to get good intelligence to counteract them. And so the one time that they used their top tier gear was in that strike in early March. And that's when the Pentagon said, no, we want no part of this. That retrospectively seems to be what has happened. I mean, we will never know until we actually see the documentation of the decision-making process, and that'll be years, if not decades. But my thinking at this point that the only American NATO troops who are on the ground are certainly, CIA critters, intelligence types of all stripes, right? And the other is probably the operators of some of the equipment, like the M777 howitzers and the HIMARS in particular, because those systems, it's not something that you just give it to somebody and here are the keys, go and use it. No, you got to train. It takes a long time. It takes months, in some cases years.
There's a lot of support material to go along with it.
That too. And so the notion that they just handed this equipment and you figure it out and here's the training manual, come on. They obviously have American operators for some of this gear. If not all of it, but at least a good portion of it. Right. And so, there are NATO and American troops on the ground, But I think it's so reduced that everybody's pretending that they're not there, but they are there. But they're not in a quantity enough that the Russians would say, okay, we're in an open war with NATO. You see what I mean? And if these men get killed, NATO is not going to go to war with Russia. You know, it's political impossibility. But that there are NATO troops, yes, but a minimal. I mean, I'd be very surprised if you told me that it was over 500 in Ukraine. I mean, do keep in mind the number of troops that we're talking about here. The Russian forces are numbering, right now it's estimated that they have about 150,000. Okay, so 150,000 on the ground in Ukraine fighting. So 500 is just a speck of dust in the whole scheme of things, right? But yeah, I think that, thank God that NATO is not getting involved in this war. But now China. Oh yeah, let's start a war with China because you know it worked out so well for poor Ukraine.
But
let's have Taiwan and throw Taiwan to the lions. You know.
But this again goes to the point that NATO, you know, it's been doing this very, very sophistical arguments, this hair splitting. And so one part of it is this: well, we don't have troops on the ground. We're not a party to the conflict. If, however, Russia extends this, if decides, hey, we need to hit targets in Poland because Poland is providing so much support for Ukraine, then that's unprovoked aggression against NATO. That's the line that they're going to come up with, just like this attack by Russia was an unprovoked aggression. So therefore, if you attack Poland, that's unprovoked aggression, and Article 5 goes into operation, one for all and all for one.
But I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's over.
I don't know, guys. I think, seriously, I think Russia wants to break the back of NATO once and for all.
Yeah.
And I think
definitely.
You know, I don't want it to happen, but I could see a scenario. George and I've talked about this at great length. I mean, you know, you have the favorite villain in Europe, Orban. I mean, so here you have, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of military hardware with foreign advisors, primarily American and British, just right over the Polish border, and the Russians attack it. Is that unprovoked? No. Who's provoking whom? And I personally think is that we could get into a scenario and say, you know, I'm going to call your bluff, okay? Because Article 5 it's not automatic. It's like everybody gets together and you have kind of a chat. What do we do here? I mean, this is so mythologized. It's ridiculous, okay? Right. And then, and talking about unprovoked, well, if you have all that military hardware and troops and advisors on the Polish border with Ukraine, does Article 1 apply?
Well, exactly.
I mean, Article 1 is in violation.
That's right. Article 1, which says that all NATO member states are obligated to resolve all conflicts by exclusively peaceful means. So therefore, the only thing that, you know, when Article 5 can be invoked, if you are indeed the victim of an unprovoked attack. You haven't done anything at all to provoke this. But I mean, given everything NATO has done, I mean, the last thing you can call it is unprovoked. So I mean, what Peter's saying is, of course, very interesting. I mean, you know, at what point would the Russians say we're fed up with this because it's ridiculous to Poland to go on Russians pretending to be a neutral and is not a party to the conflict?
And they're killing Russian troops with that material. They're killing Russians.
Yeah, I know. But the thing is, I think that the Kremlin and Putin are very, very patient. And certainly there are people within the Kremlin who want to go to war. They want to go to war with NATO. I have no doubt that there are hawks within the Kremlin. But the people who are running things are very, very shrewd people. And so it's very clear that, you know, Putin and the people who are supporting Putin, number one, they're succeeding. Okay, so they have the political wind at their back. Number two, they know the limits of what they can do. They can go right up to the border. And I think that they will go right up to the border of Ukraine and Poland, but they're going to stop there. And they're not going to mind any kind of provocation that comes from Poland or the Baltic states, so long as they don't cross the border. They don't cross the border into Ukraine. They don't cross the border into Belarus, or in the case of Estonia, they don't cross the border into Russia. I think that, and Finland, of course, doesn't cross into Russia. I think that they've made up their minds that, you know, we're going to play this, you know, close to the vest. Well, we're not going to do anything stupid. We're going to be patient. And that strategy of patience has proved remarkably effective.
Okay, well, let me throw this at you.
Sure.
I'm sure you came across this. I thought, George, I want everybody to know, well, everyone that watches the Gaggle knows, I lived in Poland for 10 years, okay?
Mhm.
And I'm always find these stories. There's no, the leadership in Kiev, leadership in war. There's no border that separates us. We're brothers in arms and all. Unfortunately, we had some bad historical experiences. Yeah, bad. That's an understatement.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a back door, isn't it? Where
That they're trying to
Poles
dissolve
are
the.
invited in,
Yeah.
carrying guns, maybe.
Yeah.
It's a very weird, ambiguous thing here. And of course, being a historian, the Poles, well, there are people that still covet those lands because it was
sure.
Poland, okay?
Sure.
And so it's kind of seamless, isn't it? I mean, it achieves a number of
Yeah,
goals.
what they're trying to do is erase the border between Ukraine and Poland, right? Yeah, they can try, but see, when it comes to the issue of actual troops crossing the border, actual Polish troops crossing the border into Ukraine, they're going to get wiped out, of course, and the Russians have said so repeatedly, okay? And the thing is, see, that they've demonstrated by the events at Yavoriv that they have the muscle to do it. It's not just empty talk. And so I have no doubt in my mind that if the Poles were foolish enough to send troops their way, that'd be that. That would be the end of these poor bastards, okay? And the thing is, see, there's also a key issue that people aren't paying enough attention to, although some people have. There was a very celebrated article in the Royal Unified Services Institute website. RUSI is a think tank of the British military. It's basically the British equivalent of the Rand Corporation. And there was a very celebrated article called The Return of Industrial Warfare. And the author, whose name slips my mind right now, but you can look it up, at the Royal Unified Services Institute, he pointed out something that is kind of devastating. He pointed out that, see, everybody in the West had assumed that industrial warfare was a thing of the past, that it was now the new war, insurgency and that sort of thing. And the thing is, see, this war is showing that, artillery is the god of war.
King.
And the thing is, he pointed out that the West does not have the industrial capacity to go head to head with the Russians. The West would run out of ammunition within a couple of months. They would not be able to sustain a long-term industrial warfare against Russia. And Russia has endless capacity because they've specifically built their military industrial complex, to coin a term. They've specifically tasked it with having the wherewithal to keep on producing in the event of the war. During these 5.5 months, the Russians are still producing artillery shells, still producing Calibre missiles, still producing all that good stuff.
3 shifts round the clock.
Right.
They're not stopping. Exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah. 24/7, just producing and stamping out gear to go blow up somebody. Okay.
Right. Yeah. You kind of
The
also wonder
Americans.
how-
Do
yeah.
you know the great problem of the Javelin missile, for instance? The Javelins were made in the 90s, right? And they require a battery pack to be able to arm them, right? Well, the thing is, see, they've been in storage for so long that the battery packs didn't work, and there were no replacements. And they kept on talking about I forget if it was the Stinger missiles or the Javelin missiles. It's not important. It was one of these handheld missile systems that you just put on your shoulder and fire away. The batteries were dead, and there was no way to revive them and no replacement because the West has forgotten about industrial warfare and the Russians never have. And so, this article, which I suggest everybody read, is very, very interesting. The Return of Industrial Warfare. And basically, it's not going to happen. The West cannot go toe-to-toe with the Russians.
It's very interesting that you say that because I remember very clearly, because I was in the RT studio, endless hours covering the conflict in Georgia. And I can remember the Western, the armchair general saying, well, this is kind of typical Russian tactics, steamrolling, just overwhelming, swarming. And I thought, yeah, because it works. Okay, yeah. It works.
Yeah.
I mean, they just, it's very antiquated and, it's not imaginative. It didn't matter. The result was what they wanted. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Does that echo what you were saying there?
Right.
No, yeah, exactly. They keep insisting on, like, for instance, Western technology, right? It's so superior to the Russian technology. It probably is. But here's the big problem. See, this M777 howitzer that they kept talking about, it was the latest wonder weapon that would, change the balance. It was a game changer. They've had so many game changers that I don't even know what sport we're playing anymore. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, these guys, they kept insisting that the M777 was a game changer until it actually was used in an actual war. And the Ukraine general, not general, he was a Ministry of Defense, Assistant Minister of Defense, who was in charge of logistics. And he said that the problem with the M77s is that, you use them in one go, one 6-hour shift, and then you needed to replace parts. It was just inoperable. And the parts were not there, or they were extremely delicate. And, it was basically, he was saying, you could use it once and that was it. And then you had to just set it aside and send it to get repaired, send it to Poland to get repaired. Whereas the Russians, their howitzers, you kick them some and it starts working again, just shovel shells into it and keep on firing, for crying out loud. I mean, there is something to be said about something simple, durable, robust. Yeah. The Americans, the West, the god of technology has overwhelmed them. So all their technology is so sophisticated, but at the first brush with basic military gear and basic military strategies and tactics and operations, they're inoperable, okay? I want to know, they have all these F-35 aircraft and F-22 aircraft that are so sophisticated. I want to know how long those planes will last in actual combat. Because the Russian planes, man, I mean, really, it's like the AK-47. They all built them to be super redundant, super simple, that work. They're not the most sophisticated. They're not even close to being sophisticated, but they work. And the Americans, of course, in the West, well, they were suckered by weapons manufacturers who wanted just more money. Yeah. And so what they did was these guys said, these are super sophisticated, and also the weapons manufacturers, super expensive. And they were thinking also, all those spare parts that are necessary are just more moolah, more of the green stuff,
Well,
and
yeah,
so
that's why they're not even been that successful, even in the wars that the U.S. has waged against mediocre opponents. I mean, mediocre relative to the United States. I mean, we're talking about the war in Vietnam. I mean, essentially, America just had to say, we're not going to win this war. We've got all this sophisticated technology. They're just a bunch of, guys in pajamas running around in the jungle, but we can't defeat them. And they did this, they bombed Yugoslavia. And then finally they had to say, well, the only way we can win this is we just destroy everything, just level Belgrade, and there'll be nothing left. That's because all the sophisticated technology wasn't actually getting them any of the results they were seeking.
A few years ago, I went to Kabul when Karzai was still president. He was leaving power, and I went down with a Russian group of journalists to interview him. And it was a really eye-opening experience. Number one, all of the architecture was Soviet in Kabul. I mean, I felt like I was in the outskirts of Moscow. I mean, even the cement was the same, okay? And that dreary green paint, it was, you know that color, okay?
Yeah.
It's all over this part of the world. Anyway, you'd see the Afghan soldiers. What did they like? They liked the army boots, because they're very nimble, very cool looking. They like the khaki uniforms, but they didn't like the gun. They had Kalashnikovs. So it really, for me, it was like, all of the trimmings of a military, it looks cool, but that's not what wins battles, okay? Yeah. It's the hardware that wins battles.
Yeah, what's shocking is that the United States has a military budget last year, just got approved something like $860 billion. And the Russians are making do with about, I do believe it was 65 billion. So it's less than a tenth. I mean, if my math is correct, it would be 1/14. You're talking about like roughly 7-8% of the American budget. And the Russians are proving themselves more capable militarily. I mean, look, let's face facts. The Americans didn't want to go into Ukraine because they got a good look at the Russians and they're like, no part of this. And it's not just the equipment, it's the soldiers. The Russian soldier and the Ukrainian soldier, for that matter. I mean, they're fighting on their home turf. This land is theirs, okay? I'm not talking about Ukraine or Russia. I'm talking about this area. This is Eastern Europe. This is Ukraine, Russia. This has been their land for millennia. and some rando American soldier shows up here, he's going to get the ever living shit kicked out of him. I'm sorry for the language, but it's the truth. And he doesn't care. He doesn't care. And on top of that, you see that the Americans, because of the vaccine mandates and this whole woke culture thing, which is like a cancer of the mind, all the best soldiers have left the US military. So, you basically have a hollow army. It's just a bunch of fools driving these very expensive military Ferraris, if you will, that are, that break all the time, that are exceedingly expensive to maintain and don't do the job. You're going to lose. And I think that the Pentagon realizes this, and that's why they want to know part of this war, because they know they'll lose. But now the crazy neocons are turning to China. I heard the word about an hour ago before I came on that the Americans rather, they want to have military ships sailing through the Strait of Taiwan while the USS Ronald Reagan monitors the situation. I'm like, it's bad enough that Pelosi went to Taiwan. Now they want to like poke the Chinese right in the eye. What the hell is the matter with these people? I mean, what drug are they taking? Please stop. Okay, just say no. That's my advice to these people, because they're crazy. They are deliberately trying to provoke a war with Russia, with China rather. They tried with Russia, didn't succeed. So now they're stirring up trouble in Kosovo, which again, let sleeping dogs lie. Oh no. We got to go and poke the dog and see if he bites. I mean, yeah, they were doing some hinky stuff with Kaliningrad. These people don't know when to quit. That's the problem. They do not know when to quit. And the thing is, see, if they keep on going like this, the United States is going to suffer a loss that is going to be far more traumatic than Afghanistan. I mean, because either China or the Russians, probably the Chinese, they're going to say, oh, we're not going to put up with this. We're just not, our sense of dignity and our self-respect does not allow us to put up with this nonsense, and they're going to hit back at the Americans.
And they have capacity now.
Oh yeah,
capacity. That's the point. And I'm really glad that you brought it up, because George mentioned this on the gaggle months ago. Is that with an estimated 150,000 troops? That is. And Putin said, what was it, 3 or 4 weeks ago? I'm paraphrasing. We haven't seen anything yet. Okay.
Yeah.
And so. Yeah, I mean, there's real capacity here, and obviously, Pentagon planners were never, they haven't fought anything like this, since Vietnam. I mean,
earlier, yeah. This kind of war hasn't been seen by the Americans since Korea.
More like Korea, yes. I agreed here.
Yeah.
And the Chinese, I mean, there are different estimates there, but I mean, George and I talked about this on Wednesday. I tend to think, and I did this on Crosstalk yesterday, and I had a Chinese guy on from Beijing, one of their think tanks, and I think I startled him. I said, look, one China policy, if both sides don't adhere to it, why should either side adhere to it? Okay, I think that's part of China's response. It's not going to be bells and whistles. It's going to be a concerted campaign, step by step by step, until we get to the point where, okay, now it's your turn, guy. What are you going to do about it? Okay, I think that's what's in really play here. But the timing of it, I mean, that's what really I find really bizarre. You're in the dumps. I mean, even the Washington Post and the New York Times are beginning to pull the curtain back. The communication with Washington and Zelensky isn't as good.
No, they're setting him up to dump him.
Well, the problem was also with Zelensky, which is that he's kind of shooting his mouth off all the time.
Oh, God.
Which is okay, so long as he's announcing
he's an actor.
The Russians. Why. But when one of his flunkies said, well, whenever we target anything, we don't do it without the Americans signing off on it.
Yeah, I know.
So when they say this, and they just launched this attack against this prison, he's pretty much saying, hey, this was a war crime, and the Americans signed off on it. Now, this is very problematic. I mean, it basically
it's a disaster.
Because the Americans always say, hey, it wasn't us. We didn't commit a war crime. It was they. They did it. Nothing to do with us. We're not a party to this. But this Ukrainians say, no, we don't target anything without the Americans either telling us what to target or telling us what not to target. So they obviously signed off on this. So they blurted out that America is responsible for a war crime. This kind of thing is the Americans don't like. That's a very dangerous admission. And then you had this Amnesty International report the other day, which said,
basically saying that the Zelensky regime is
crimes.
Well, what's happening, of course, is the following. See, if you think of it internally in Kiev, right? This attack on the prisoner of war camp. Let's talk about that in Donetsk city. What happened, of course, was that this missile was fired from the Ukrainian side. It clearly, by trajectory, everyone was like, yeah, it was, and the pieces of it that they found in situ were, pieces of HIMARS. Okay, so it was definitely the American weapon system. That weapon system, it is generally believed that it is operated by Americans. Its targeting information is most definitely provided by the Americans, because the Americans don't want to give that technology to anybody in case it slips into enemy hands. And so the Americans knew exactly what was being hit, number one. Number two, the Ukraine, the Zelensky regime and the Poroshenko regime before it were hitting Donetsk relentlessly for 8 years of shelling. So they know that city down to the square centimeter. They know exactly what they're hitting at any given time. So it wasn't some stray missile, some accident. It was very deliberate. Now, why did they hit it? Well, because, you're starting to see a lot of testimony of Azov fighters with the Nazi tattoos and the whole shebang, right? They are testifying and saying things that really incriminates the Zelensky regime, the Ukrainian leadership class generally, all kinds of stuff about how Mariupol, the civilians were used as human shields and they were shot at, all kinds of war crimes, right? And so they were like, we got to shut them up. Let's just, hit them with a missile and blame the Russians, like they tried to do at Kramatorsk. Remember the Kramatorsk train station? I'll never forget that one. The only reason they stopped talking about it was that Italian TV crew stumbled on the piece of the missile and filmed the serial number, and it was right in the middle of the list of serial numbers that were known to belong to Ukraine or to the Zelensky regime. And so anyway, they deliberately targeted that POW camp. I mean, the Zelensky regime even told the Russians to move them to this prison. There was some reason for it. I forget exactly the details. It's so important. They knew exactly who they were hitting. They hit them deliberately. And now in Kiev, the problem is that the far right forces that are there, because Azov as a functioning unit, as a political unit, is gone. But there are sympathizers, far right, crazy ass neo-Nazi sympathizers in Kiev that are saying, hey, you killed our guys. They're saying to the Zelensky regime and his little circle. And so the Zelensky regime, they have to save their butts, and they're blaming it on the Americans. And the Americans aren't liking this because it was obviously some decision that was taken in concert between Zelensky and the Americans, because of course, the testimony of these Azov prisoners of war would implicate Zelensky just as much as it would implicate the minions in Washington. And so, there is no honor among thieves, of course. This is, the prisoner's dilemma. Zelensky immediately pointed the finger through his subordinates, through his spokespeople, and said, oh yeah, the Americans did the targeting. And now the Americans are like, dude, and you see what's going on. This is the situation. And it's a complicated story, but once you understand the individual moving parts, it's really easy to understand the motivation. Basically, they know that they're losing. And so they're starting to blame each other. I did a video that was very celebrated and they got a lot of views. And I speculated that the Americans might make up their minds that it's better off to have a dead Zelensky than a living Zelensky. And I wouldn't put it past the Americans to do this. I mean, they killed the South Vietnam president back in '63.
And go DM.
I would add to that is that, just from what you've been saying here, Zelensky's outside of the ridiculous media coverage, Vogue magazine and all that stuff, he's losing.
Believe that.
He's losing friends left and right. Okay. Oh, yeah. And I've been, asked, about Zelensky very often, and I said, well, if he's actually a boon for the Russians, because the more he flaps his mouth, okay, the more he says things that embarrass him, his regime, and his sponsors. I mean,
Yeah.
they could have taken him out on day one, and they didn't.
Yeah.
And they won't. They won't. Okay.
No, they won't.
I think, and George and I have talked about this at great length, is that they're
going to blame the Russians.
Well, no, they're going to have a regime change. Of course, you can blame, the heat on the Russians if you want.
Oh, no. My thinking is that what's going to happen is that the Americans are going to shoot a HIMARS at Zelensky and blame the Russians. That's my suspicion. Yeah, because the thing is, they built him up so much that they can't now pull him down with the press. He's like the new Winston Churchill, And all of these people like Mike Pompeo and all the people at State Department, all these people, all of the people of the blob, if you will, they've built him up so much that they cannot now tear him down. And that's the thing.
Oh, yeah. But the drawback to that, and it's an interesting idea, is that if he's assassinated, and
he's a saint. He's a saint.
He's immediately blame the Russians. Oh yeah, the Russians did it. We've got absolutely irrefutable proof that the Russians were behind this.
Oh yeah.
There will be enormous pressure at that moment for America to get in. It's going to be hard for a weak government like Biden's to withstand the pressure to get more directly involved. And as you said earlier, and I agree, the Americans don't want to get directly involved. This is just too problematic. Once they kill Zelensky and blame the Russians, there'll just be hysteria. I mean, Washington would just go crazy and demand that we go directly to war with Russia.
Yeah, but see, George, see, there is your mistake, because you, as a thinking individual, realize the secondary consequences of your actions. You realize, well, if this happens, then this other thing is going to happen. This other thing we don't want to happen, so we're not going to do this thing, because you are a smart, educated, knowledgeable man. These people in Washington don't think that way because they don't have the brain cells, okay? Actually, no, they do have the
ideology. They're ideologically possessed. That's what is the problem here.
But also what's more important, Peter, is that they're panicking.
Yeah. But still, they can't work outside of their ideological precepts. That's the problem here.
Yeah.
The reality on the ground is getting so divorced from their propaganda that they are panicking. Absolutely.
Yeah. And they're freaking out.
That's not a good thing.
No, because a person or institution that acts in a panic makes catastrophically bad decisions. It's a truth universally acknowledged. You never make a decision in the heat of the moment. You never make a decision when you're angry or scared. But these people don't understand that. And so what George is saying is totally accurate. He was saying his train of thinking is, if they kill Zelensky and blame the Russians, the push for war will be so fierce and powerful because of how Zelensky has been built up that it will be politically impossible for the Biden regime to not send troops to Ukraine. And therefore, the United States would be in a direct war with Russia, which it will lose. And that's the train of thought, George. Correct me if I'm
no, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And so you, George, are completely accurate that we don't want US versus Russia head to head. We don't want it under any circumstances. But these people are only going to be thinking, Zelensky is embarrassing us. Zelensky is more trouble than he's worth. We can't tear him down. How do we get rid of him? Light bulb moment. Let's just send a missile and blame the Russians. And I'm afraid that that's what they might possibly do, and I think it would be a disaster. It would be a complete and utter disaster, and it would draw the United States into a war. No question.
I'm just thinking, remember at the end of Network, when they decide how do we resolve this problem with Howard Beale?
Kill Howard Beale.
Just kill him?
Yeah.
Oh, you're just joking, of course, aren't you? Okay, and boom, there he is. They kill him. So it's like it's the only way they can solve the Howard Beale problem.
Yeah, and so the Zelensky problem. Look, it's such a neat solution from their point of view, because they're thinking we tried to pull him down is going to take weeks. We off him in one go, and he's a saint, and we can do whatever we want. I think that's what the rationale, and I think it's a disaster. But they're not going to listen to us.
We have said in our conversation here, so the Pentagon knows the true reading of this. I mean, there'd be such political pressure for Magnificent Millie there to sign off on it. Well, wow. there's another resume going down the toilet. I mean, being held responsible for such a catastrophic decision. But I mean, we see it with Taiwan. I mean, these people are going for broke. I mean, this is just really extraordinary times to be living in.
There's
Well,
also
what's obvious is that this reflects that the United States as a nation is collapsing. Okay, I mean, let's not fool ourselves. The bottom line is that the United States, as a nation state, is collapsing. Its economy is in free fall. Its currency is collapsing because of the money printing that's been going on over the last 27 months or so. The whole thing is falling apart, and they don't know how to fix it. They can't fix it. It's beyond salvaging. And so they figure that what they have to do is have a nice little war with somebody, anyone. And this war will potentially, they're thinking that just like World War II, the United States will become the arsenal of democracy, and it'll start up business, and it'll be like, the ultimate Keynesian move. I mean, what's his name? Paul Krugman is just salivating at the notion of a large-scale war for the United States. He said repeatedly that a large-scale war would solve the American economy. He's insane.
George,
What?
you talked about him, Tisdale at the Guardian, I think it is.
Oh,
There's another moron.
Yeah, Simon Tisdale. Yeah. Ready to go to war. Notice they're all, elderly men who will not be called upon to do any fighting.
It's real easy for them.
But there's also the other aspect. I mean, Lavrov said the other day, essentially, that we're now going for regime change. I mean, that it seems like that is now an objective of Moscow. We need to have a regime change. We need to liberate the Ukrainian people from the gangsters who are now running it. So that's an interesting aspect of it, because I think Lavrov doesn't just shoot his mouth off.
Oh no,
that's clearly
that man thinks every word 6 ways to Sunday before he articulates them. Yeah, no question. And I think that he's right. Okay, what will happen is that the Russians, once they break through Kramatorsk, they're going to overrun all the land of north of the Donbass, and they will get to Dnipropetrovsk and Cherkasy on the Dnieper River. They will probably cross it and keep on going, because ultimately, see, there's nothing in the middle of Ukraine. It's all cow country. Now, all these heavy fortifications, people are saying, oh, it shows that the Russians are losing because, they're stuck there. It's a static war. No, it's not. They're patiently grinding through all of those defenses. They're about to break through the last defenses, the last defensive line, which is at Kramatorsk. Once they break through it, there is nothing between Kramatorsk all the way to the far west of Ukraine, to Lviv. There's nothing. There's just cows and well, not cows really. There aren't that many cows, but wheat fields. There's nothing. Okay,
it's a step. It's a step.
Exactly. Okay, and so they're going to roll across that country, and that countryside rather. And they're going to get to Lviv, and Odessa's going to fall. They're not going to attack and assault Odessa. Why would they? All they have to do is surround it and cut it off. They're going to link up with Transnistria. Sorry for just using my hand. This is the high tech, stuff that I do. But they're going to go from Kherson here, and over here. Once they break through the Donbass, they're going to link up and go all the way to Transnistria and Odessa down here, if you will. It's going to be cut off. And what happens to a city that gets cut off from all supplies? Well, it's going to fall. It's simple as that. And so they don't need to assault it. They just cut it off, and it'll fall like a ripe apple, right? And insofar as the west of the Ukraine, they're going to keep on driving all the way to the border with Poland, and that's all she wrote. I do not think that the Poles would be foolish enough to actually invade Ukraine, because, like I said before, they'll be hit, and it'll hurt too hard. Okay, and Article 5 doesn't come into play if Poland invades Ukraine. Okay, no, because it'd
be a violation of Article 1.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Poles would be on their own. The Americans are certainly going to support them in all kinds of ways. But that's when the Russians would pull out their first string gear and really show NATO what it's got. And I don't think NATO really wants to see that. So I honestly don't think that there is going to be a war in between the US and Russia, except in the case that George outlined. that they decide that it's better to have a dead Zelensky than a living one, and that causes a cascade, a causal cascade that leads to war, as was outlined before. That's the only possibility at this point. And you know, fingers crossed. I don't care about Zelensky. I think he's a war criminal and a scumbag and a thief and a liar and just a generalized bastard. And he's got the souls of all those dead Ukrainian soldiers, very brave men who died for nothing. And all those men's souls are going to be on his conscience, you know. But I don't care about Zelensky. I certainly don't care if he lives or dies, right? But I certainly don't want his fate, his death potentially, to cause even greater mayhem and death in this region.
Gentlemen, I have to step away for like 5 minutes. If you want to keep going, I'll rejoin you, but I have to, courier.
Sure.
Okay. George, you want to keep going?
Yeah, we'll keep going for a few more minutes and you come back and then we'll just wrap it up.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right. No, I think that I think you're right. I mean, I can only envisage Poland getting involved if once Ukraine disintegrates, and then if Ukraine disintegrates, then they can just move in and say, well, we have to step in to avoid, you know, refugee crisis, you know, complete instability and so on. But that I think that would be the only condition under which Poland would get in. Only if Ukraine is just disintegrating, and then they have to just say, "Hey, well, we had no choice."
I think that the Russians are probably I mean, they obviously, these people have backdoor channels that they can communicate with one another. And I suspect that the Russians have made it very clear to the Poles: don't cross that border. You're not going to like it, even if there's a quote unquote humanitarian crisis. Don't cross it. I think the Poles got the message, especially with the Kaliningrad situation, because you know how there was like this notion that, oh, Kaliningrad is like, you know, and the Lithuanians doing all kinds of idiocy there. Jesus Christ. I mean, talk about a Chihuahua barking at a pit bull. I mean, that was just stupid, you know. But anyway, you know, I think that the Kaliningrad situation kind of like crystallized it for the Poles, rather, that, you know, messing with the Russians is just not worth it. But we'll see. The problem that we have is that we have such incompetent leadership. We have such leaders of such galactic stupidity that, you know, anything can happen. Anything can happen. And that's the thing that that frightens me most of all.
No,
because these people out of ego.
No,
I'm sorry?
No, I absolutely agree. I think that's the problem. Like, as we were saying, as likely as not, there won't be a war between the United States and Russia. We can't rule it out. You know, the possibility is not negligible. But the problem is, of course, that the supposedly rational voices have been destroyed, because ultimately NATO runs everything. And if NATO runs everything, it means the United States runs it. So what you might have expected in the past, you know, you might have had a Gerhard Schroeder, you might have had a Helmut Schmidt, De Gaulle, or whatever, Chirac, or somebody who could have said, look, this can't go on. You know, we need to sit down, you know, hammer out some sort of a peace agreement. There aren't those voices. I mean, ultimately, the United States calls all the shots, because anything that Macron comes up with will immediately be rendered null and void by the United States shipping off yet more HIMARS to Ukraine, and that's it. So what's the point of you know, coming up with any peace plan if we're just going to send, you know, Zelensky yet even more money and even more arms? Yeah, keep the, you know, Vladimir, keep the war going. You know, just you do what you want to do.
Yeah, I think it's crazy, but you know, this is the world we live in. There is no way to stop this realistically, and so, you know, we have to see how it plays out. And like I said, my at this time, I'm not a betting man, but if I were a betting man, I'd say that the odds of NATO getting involved in this are maybe 1 in 5, you know, 1 in 6, perhaps. There is, like you said, it's not negligible, but there's a possibility. Now, but the war between the U.S. and China, 100%, that's happening. No question. That is happening 100%. That war, and I think that the Chinese finally with this Pelosi visit, they know for a fact the war is coming. Get ready for it. Batten down the hatches, because this war is coming. If not now, maybe next year or the year after that, it's coming inevitably. The Americans want it. They want it. That's the insane part. They want a war. I mean, you know, the thing about a war, like any physical conflict of any sort, be it a street fight, you know, a gang fight, a war, whatever, it's always unpredictable. And the guy who has the muscle and the strongest, he doesn't necessarily win. Sometimes the little guy or the guy that you don't think can win, he has something up his sleeve, and all of a sudden that's curtains for you. And I think that the Americans don't seem to understand this.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, a lot depends on who gets the first blow in. I mean, it's like you know, if you're watching gangster movies, you know, somebody, you know, he turns around as if he doesn't want to fight. You know, he just hits you on the head, which breaks your nose, and that's it. You're on the ground, and then the little guy can actually prevail simply because he got the first blow in. And that's all. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you will prevail in the end. I mean, even that was the problem with Germany. Germany knows we have to get our first blow in. We don't have the resources for a long war. And yeah, Germany is very good at getting early victories, but it's not so good at enduring long war when it's with its limited resources come into play, its geographic vulnerabilities come into play. But definitely, if you get the first blow in, you know, that helps enormous amount.
Yeah, well, look, I've speculated, and a lot of people thought I was just crazy, and I will admit that the idea I have is crazy. It's really crazy. But I speculated that if I were the Chinese, I would hit them now, because you catch them with their pants down. They're not ready for it. The Americans are not ready for it. And I think that if the Americans provoke them hard enough, they might do it. Because one has to understand two things about what I've noticed about Chinese as a people is that on the one hand, they are extraordinarily patient. They will take their sweet time with their goals and their plans, and they will try to minimize conflict. But on the other hand, when they feel that they have been disrespected, dishonored, when you really rile their hackles, right, they get hysterical and they lash out fiercely. This seems to be the way that the national psyche is, because I am a believer that different peoples, they tend to have different psyches. I've lived in enough different places to recognize this. You know, people in Italy are vastly different from Dutchmen. There is a different mentality, a different approach, and it's a national thing. And the weird thing is that a lot of times an immigrant will live long enough in one country or another, and he will absorb and adopt as his own that mentality. And the Chinese, from what I have experienced on a personal level, insofar as doing business with Chinese, and of seeing, you know, them interacting in a business environment and a political environment, they are patient until they lash out.
But that's the problem. They don't necessarily have the good judgment. This is something that Peter and I discussed the other day, which was that, you know, unlike the Russians, the Chinese do a lot of blustering. And there's a problem about blustering, because if you bluster and then you don't really follow through on your threats, then people think you're an idiot.
Like now.
Yeah, exactly. They kind of they take it as a joke. The Russians don't do that. Russians do not bluster. They are very patient. You know, they take insults and they just wait till the moment to strike. You know, they're not going to go out on a limb and start a fight that they don't think they can win. And I think that's where they go.
The phrase that George and I always use: the Russians don't bluff. They act.
Yeah. And there's also another thing about the Russians. I've said this many times before, and so forgive me if I might be repeating myself, but see, different peoples are good at different things. The Chinese are great merchants. The Italians, you know, great at food, and the French great at fashion. The Russians, they're good at war. It's as simple as that. It's not complicated. They know how to fight a war. I suspect in a perverse way, and I mean no disrespect to the Russian people, but I think that in a weird way in their core, they kind of like it because it crystallizes everything. There's no more ambiguity. When you're at war, you're at war. And I think that it appeals to the very, you know, basic, straightforward approach of the Russians of like, let's go and just kick the shit out of these people.
I wouldn't say they.
I mean, no disrespect, by the way. No disrespect.
I think there's a nuanced way here. I don't think they like war, but they understand existential threats.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's something they've had a long history with. It's a people that it's a to be or not to be situation.
Yeah.
Look, I've been living here for a quarter century.
Yeah, you're right.
The Russians, you know, the law applies to you, but not to me. It's a mentality that you see a lot. Okay, but then at a certain point, there is everything gels, everything coalesces. It's like this is one of those moments,
Right.
and it's very badly understood in the West intentionally. But the Second World War is here with me in this country every single day,
Yep.
every heartbeat.
Yeah.
And that's something the West doesn't understand. What Russia's in a to be or not to be moment. That's when people get mobilized. That's when all the squabbling comes to an end, and they have a goal. I'm going to go right with you right now. They have a goal. This is what we have to do. We have to do it, and we don't mess around. And I'll tell you, the first 2 months of the conflict, the grumblings were, when are the gloves coming off? People are getting impatient. It's time to finish this. Let's get this over with. Because we will win. We will win. There's no doubt in anyone's mind. We will win.
Yeah. You know, and what's interesting about it is that you think of Tolstoy. He wrote War and Peace, I want to say in 1865, 1867, around there, in the late 60s of the 19th century, of course. And I do believe that at the time that he wrote it, it was a huge bestseller in Russia, obviously. But see, people were still thinking about the Napoleonic Wars. You know, and they had been 50 odd years, almost 60 years before, but it was still present. It was still the thing, you know, because the Russians, like you say, they know about existential wars. They know about being invaded and potentially being annihilated as a people. And that kind of mentality, when you're done, you're done. And I think it's you know, I don't understand it. You know, I don't understand why they're so foolish.
In the West,
the West. In
the West, they don't understand is when the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, the Tsar was in Paris. When the Second World War was over, Stalin was in Berlin. That's the way they see endings here. And George and I have made it very clear. They're not going to take a half measure. Why? Do it 5 years from now? Do it 10 years from now?
Do it now. Get it over with now.
That's right, and that's why if you look through the wartime diplomacy of Stalin, you could see Stalin was thinking in terms of a peace for a couple of generations. In other words, he's thinking about, you know, we want to eliminate all threats to the Soviet Union for at least 50 years, which is kind of what they got until Gorbachev
pretty much
it all away. In other words, we're not going back to the situation we had before World War II, when we were continually worrying about Europe ganging up on us and invading us. You know, we're not going to be worrying about that for another 50 years, and you know and that's what they had. So I think that's what they're thinking now. We're not going to go back to where we were, with the Minsk agreements and relying on Germany and France and the United States to implement. It's like all these ridiculous articles we've talked about so many times on anti-war.com, responsible state.
No articles. No more articles.
Let's have Minsk 3 and autonomy. We want autonomy in the Donbass. You know, we'll settle for that. You know,
George, you should work for responsible statecraft and support Minsk 3, and you'll probably be able to hire on the money, be able to say such garbage. Okay.
No, but let me ask you something, Peter. You're in Moscow right now, correct? What do Russians generally think when they think of victory in this situation? How do they envision it? What is, forget about what Lavrov and Maria Zakharova and Putin himself might be saying. You know, I mean, again, no disrespect to either any of those three people, but how do Russians view victory? What would make them happy? What would they say? Yes, we won.
You know what bothers people most? Mm-hmm. It's the human dimension, because so many families have relatives that are in Ukraine. And this is the greatest tragedy for people here, is how are we going to mend this fence that has been torn down? Now, I'm far more partisan, okay, and much more politically driven because I think about this stuff and I talk about this stuff all the time.
Right.
But other people don't. They have their day-to-day lives. But how are they going to mend this chasm that has been created with Ukraine? Because people can criticize me all they want, but for Russians, Ukraine is an extension of the Russian space. I mean, they are a separate people. They have a separate state. There's no denying that. But as much as the Western media has never been able to do service to Ruski Mir, because the Ukrainians will say, we don't want to be part of Ruski Mir, but nobody explains what that means in Western media. But here it's very meaningful. And it's not, there's no malice involved. It's not like forcing anybody to do anything. So, victory is that when we stop fighting each other and want to fight each other, it could be, the vast majority of people are not political here. People here want results from the government. If they don't get results, they don't give a hoot about the government. Okay,
right.
If they generate results, that's okay.
Yeah,
okay,
right.
All the other trimmings and all of this garbage that you hear in the West, they don't care about. They want results. They want streets that are clean. They want schools to teach their kids. They want prosperity. They want dignity. Okay, and that's it. That's the long and the short of it. Victory is to stop the killing of brotherly nations, because they do feel that way about Ukraine. Not about the Nazis, not about Zelensky, not about the oligarchs, but the poor suffering of people in Ukraine. People are, through couriers, are sending money. It's almost like an underground railroad, where people are going in and they're giving them cash. They say, get this to my babushka, get this to my aunt, and people are working furiously to do that because the whole banking system has collapsed. That's what they want. And that's what, again, this existential, they understand what people are going through in Ukraine because that's what the West does to us.
Right. Yeah. So that's completely valid. But I have to insist on the point. What do you think the Russians would view, like taking Kiev, taking all of Ukraine, or?
I don't think, obviously I talked to my good friend Dmitry Babich and other Russians, and they will give me a very clear answer. But for average people,
it's just peace.
They just want peace. That's what they want. Yeah. It doesn't mean, regime type. Well, no, I mean, if you dig a little deeper, get rid of those Nazis. I had a friend of mine, a young lady, she said, if all those Azov people and they're found guilty, she said, I would love to collectively throw the switch on all of them. This is like a 22-year-old, okay?
Yeah, I would not, I don't really disagree with her sentiment because I understand completely. Yeah. And so it's good to know that the mentality is not we are conquering; it's rather we are. Yeah.
Well, anyway,
but in the West they don't understand that.
How do you conquer your front? How do you conquer your front yard?
Yeah,
okay?
good point. Yeah,
exactly. Anyway, look, this is a really great discussion. Thank you so much, Gonzalo, for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yet another very stimulating discussion. I think we all learned a lot and enjoyed very much. I'm sure gagglers will enjoy it a great deal. So I hope you'll be able to join us again very shortly. And
I'd be delighted.
Give us an update on what's going on. Thank you, Peter. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.